This presentation looks at the second prohibition being discussed in the WTO negotiations on fisheries subsidies, and that's of prohibiting subsidies to stocks of fish that are already in an overfished condition. And in this part of the negotiations, the main approach the discussions are focusing on is one in which subsidies would be prohibited for the fishing of a stock that is overfished, and if one of two other factors are also present. So the stock is overfished and either not recovering, so there's a lack of recovery, or the level of the stock is continuously falling. And as a reminder, we're talking here about a rule that focuses on the quantity of the fish stock, the size of the fish stock that's left in the sea, what biologists would often call the stock's biomass. So governments may decide that a stock is overfished if its biomass is significantly below what it would naturally be. And I was looking at an example of a government regulation the other day that decided a fish stock was overfished if its biomass was, for example, 20% of what its natural unfished biomass would be. So in general, we're talking about stocks of fish that are, in terms of size, volume, weight, significantly less than what they would naturally be. And so perhaps to clarify a question that I think can sometimes get lost in translation between English and Spanish and French, when we talk about overfished stocks, we're not talking about a stock where overfishing is taking place, and so it is in the process of being overfished. We're talking here about a stock that is in an overfished condition, so its state is overfished. So coming back to the way that the discussion is heading, essentially the rule would prohibit subsidies in a relatively limited set of circumstances, where there is a decision that a stock is in an overfished condition and where the stock is essentially not recovering, not getting better. And this approach reflects a balance between two broad positions that members took in the negotiations until last year. There were some that wanted a very strict prohibition on all subsidies to any stock that was overfished, in an overfished condition, and other members who wanted a prohibition only on subsidies that had a negative effect on stocks that were in an overfished condition. So what this balance does is that it allows for subsidies to continue if a stock is in an overfished condition, but it is recovering back to a healthy level. And there's an additional layer of flexibility here too. Even if the two conditions are met, it's overfished and there's one of the factors present, members can continue to provide subsidies if they can demonstrate that they have measures in place to ensure the stock will recover in the future. So that's the overall approach of the discussions. Now, what are the key decisions still to be made? Broadly, there are two, and I'm conscious that I'm squashing lots of issues together here. But the first decision is how we would establish that a stock is overfished for the purposes of this discipline. And here there are probably two general options and an additional variable that we think might be used to find a balance between the two. So one option is to use what we internally call an objective definition. And so that's a definition of when a stock is overfished, and all members would need to take that definition into account when they decide how to link their subsidy provision and their fisheries decisions. So some of the options on the table propose or suggest that a stock should be considered to be in an overfished condition if its level, its biomass, is so low that fishing has to be reduced in order to enable it to return to a level that it can produce maximum sustainable yield. This is this concept of MSY. MSY, maximum sustainable yield, or an alternative point that the government identified as a target. An alternative or a different option would be to give greater deference to national authorities or to regional fisheries management organisations, assuming that they have a mandate to do this, that authorities and RFMOs could use more or less any criteria they liked to decide when a stock is overfished for the purposes of these subsidy rules. Now, this approach obviously provides greater flexibility for members to decide when the subsidy prohibition applies, but of course in providing greater flexibility, it also could lead to slightly less effective disciplines. There's another question here, which is a question or a decision in itself, but we thought we'd add it here because we think it could be used as a variable to either make the first option more flexible, an objective definition more flexible, or to make the second option, deference, slightly more strict. And the question here is, what level of scientific information an authority would have to take into account in making its decision of whether a stock is overfished and therefore whether subsidies should be stopped. Now, the stricter option would require authorities to base their decisions on the best scientific evidence available. A more flexible option would allow an authority to base its decision only on evidence that it recognised. So it would give it more control over the evidence that it considered in its decision. The second sort of big decision in terms of the overfished stocks discipline is what, if any, special and differential treatment would be appropriate and effective in the context of this subsidy prohibition. And here again, there are a couple of different options. Some members have suggested allowing a longer time frame before subsidies to fishing of overfished stocks had to be withdrawn. So, for example, 2 years if the decision relates to fishing within the EEZ. Another option would allow subsidies for fishing of overfished stocks to continue if that fishing took place within the territorial sea. And again, we're talking about fishing within a relatively narrow band of sea, very close to the coast. There are some other questions that remain to be resolved, questions like how the discipline might apply to unassessed stocks. But we think that these two key decisions are probably those that are most important to focus on, at least for now, in structuring and in deciding what the function of the rule would be and how its overall design would achieve changes to subsidy patterns.